Week 3 in our study of Old Testament characters. Not characters as in the sense of like a fictional book's characters, but the characters of the people who appear in the Old Testament. And I have opted to go with Lot this week. Not someone we often study. In fact, I challenge you to recount to me any time you've ever heard a lesson or a sermon chiefly focused on Lot. But he has piqued my curiosity by being mentioned in the Old Testament, or in the New Testament, 2 Peter chapter 2, as an example of how, if you look at chapter 2 of 2 Peter, verse 6, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what's going to happen to the ungodly, and if he rescued righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked. For as that righteous man lived among them day after day, he was tormenting his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard. As an example of how the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials. And so I started looking at Lot a little more closely. Because he's sort of this side character. He's almost treated more as a piece of stage equipment, really. You don't see much of him, but he pops up all over the place. Starting in Genesis 11, where we find these are the generations of Terah. Now, Terah fathered Abram, we know that name, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran fathered Lot. But Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred in Ur of the Chaldeans. So before Abram ever heard the call to leave his land and head out to the land of promise, one of his brothers had died, leaving a son. And there's no mention of his mother. So essentially, Lot was orphaned in the land of Ur of the Chaldeans and taken up by his grandfather first, because we find in verse 31 that Terah took Abram, his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans into the land of Canaan. But they stopped partway in a place called Haran. The word Haran pops up so many times in these verses in 3 different contexts that it just gets a bit confusing. But this is the place Haran, not Lot's father Haran, nor the father of Nahor's wife Milcah. Must have been a really popular name. But you see, Lot keeps popping up. First, he's swept along by his grandfather. Then his grandfather dies, and the Lord says to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." We know that passage, the promise made to him, in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. So you see, Lot is living alongside this covenant promise. Not exactly part of Abram's household. He was probably quite young, and Abram, I'm thinking, was taking care of his inheritance that he had gotten from his father Haran. But they all go together. Abram, Sarai, and Lot, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and all the people they had acquired, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. Right. So you see, as Abram's story unfolds, Lot is a witness to it all the way along. He moves with Abram to Canaan. He then rides out the famine in Canaan by going with Abram to Egypt. We don't have that at the beginning of the story about Abram and Sarai in Egypt. But at the end, if you look at chapter 13, verse 1, so Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all he had, and Lot with him. He's still there. But apparently Abram was a little too good at increasing both their possessions, because when they come back into Canaan, there's a problem. They're both extremely rich in livestock, so that, it says, verse 6, the land could not support both of them dwelling together. So Abram gives Lot a choice. We're standing here at a crossroads. Let's not argue. You choose one way, I'll go the other, and we'll occupy different lands in peace. It is quite generous of him to, as the elder, give the younger first choice. So here's our first intimation of Lot's character. Genesis 13, verse 10. Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. Now, if we didn't know anything else but that, we know that he looked both ways, saw that the one was infinitely superior looking, and chose that. But the parenthesis is kind of important here. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So the Jordan Valley looks beautiful and lush, but there is poison in it. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and he journeyed east. So thus they separated from one another. And it says that while Abram settled in the land of Canaan, Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. We are told right up front, the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. So here's our setup. Lot, younger, although he has been a witness to Abram's relationship with the Lord, he has probably absorbed a great deal of the ethics. Yet, when he makes this vital choice, he chooses the attractive environment and moves up right into the shadow of what could be counted as one of the most infamous civilizations of the ancient Near East. So Abram settles in Canaan. It's not a bad place, but it's not nearly as lush and well populated as the Jordan Valley. The main difference is that Abram has the promise of the Lord, that where he stands will belong to his offspring, that will be like the dust of the earth, right? So numerous that you would be insane to try to count them. And so he settles in by the oaks of Mamre. Mamre is actually a person, so they're named after some local figure. And he builds an altar to the Lord. You might wonder why, at chapter 14, we get this interval of local political upheaval. You have various city-states ruled by little kings, and one is a bit bigger than the other. In fact, he had been exercising sovereignty over certain other cities, including Sodom and Gomorrah. And when these other cities decide that they're going to rebel against him, they go to war, and they do very poorly. And in the midst of this, not only do some of the people of the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fall into tar pits, and the rest flee to the hill country, leaving their possessions in the hands of their enemies. But also, it says, chapter 14, verse 12, they also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went their way. Why he was wrapped up with them in the first place is a question. But the fact stands that he was. Because now it says he was dwelling in Sodom. He had not just moved his tents near, but he was dwelling in the city. And he was somehow persuaded, apparently, to participate in this uprising. And so he shares the defeat. But somebody escapes and comes and tells Abram that his kinsmen had been taken captive. And so he rides out with all the resources he has to go and rescue Lot. And he wins. Though he has not terribly many people, but they are trained, and his strategy is good, and the Lord is with him. So here's Lot in trouble due to association with bad neighbors, and Abram comes to rescue him. Pause for a moment. After his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet Abram at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed him, Abram said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hands." And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. The curious fact is that these are the only 3 verses in which this character, Melchizedek, appears. He says one thing and he does one. It's really short. So you would think, blip on the radar. His New Testament presence is much, much greater than his Old Testament presence. He has one other place he pops up in the Old Testament, and that's in Psalm 110, which is, so I'm told, one of the most quoted psalms in the New Testament, a royal psalm, a messianic psalm. The one that says, "The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter. Rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people will offer themselves freely on the day of your power in holy garments. From the womb of the morning, the dew of your youth will be yours. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. The Lord is at your right hand. He will shatter kings on the day of his wrath. He will execute judgment among the nations, filling them with corpses. He will shatter chiefs over the wide earth. He will drink from the brook by the way. Therefore, he will lift up his head." All right, so the 3 verses in Genesis 14, 1 verse in Psalm 110. That's everything we know about Melchizedek. And then you get to Hebrews. It's probably just natural for humans to find something mysterious and start to ponder on it and expand beyond the original. Because starting in chapter 5 of Hebrews, they use Melchizedek and the prophecy about him, that you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, to support the idea of Christ as high priest. And it is not my intention, because we're talking about Lot, this is sort of a bonus here, but Lot's rescue brings up this curious character who becomes fascinating to later Jewish scholarship, so much so that a Christian writer recounts all kinds of things about this mysterious Melchizedek. And his context to the promised Messiah. And a quick summary, he talks about the name of this priest, right? Melchizedek. If you look at chapter 7 of Hebrews, he starts into it in earnest. By translation of his name, King of Righteousness, also called King of Salem, of Peace. He has no genealogy mentioned about him, so he's listed as without father or mother or genealogy, and having neither beginning of days nor end of life. There's a bit of a stretch there, you can see, just because it's not mentioned. He appears out of nowhere, and there is no mention of his ending. Yet, the significance of the last part of verse 20, Abram gave him a tenth of everything. That the one blessed by God with a promise that through him all who live on earth should be blessed, submits to offer him a tithe. And so this is used to support the argument of a priesthood outside of and greater than the one under the law. All of this out of 3 verses. So next time you find yourself in Hebrews, I want you to remember where we found this, so you can go back and remind yourself of what they're talking about, because otherwise you're in Hebrews, you're like, huh? But this incident ends basically in Lot being restored to his possessions and his freedom. But what does he do with them? Apparently, he goes straight back to Sodom. We lose sight of Lot after the Melchizedek incident for a few more chapters, as we are tracing through Abram becoming Abraham and the promise of his son, the mess with Hagar and her son, all the way to the end of chapter 18. Not that Lot is mentioned there, but if you remember that he lived in Sodom, this is kind of important. You have to remember the context. Why is Abram arguing so persistently about sparing if you should happen to find X number of people who are still righteous? He starts at 50. And he goes all the way down to 10. The problem being, there really is only one. And that's Lot. So that sets the scene. There's a little bit more scene setting, because chapter 19 starts with 2 angels arriving at Sodom in the evening. And Lot is sitting in the gate. We don't have this custom, but the gate was a very popular place for the men of the city to sit, the ones who had some leisure, who had some influence, some wealth, usually. And the idea was they would talk there, they would exercise business matters, casual conference sort of place. And so Lot is sitting among them, and he sees visitors arrive. The question that comes to my mind here is, how often had he sat in the gate waiting for visitors so that he could just kind of whisk them away to safety before anyone could get started? Because he seems awfully practiced at this. When he saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth and said, "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way." He's like, come out of sight, come to my house, and you can leave really early. Odd sort of greeting to give if you don't know what the city is like. And the people, the 2 angels, they make as if they don't know. "No, we'll spend the night in the town square." You can almost hear Lot go, no, no, you can't do that. You mustn't do that. Come to my house. Trust me, come to my house. But it only says, but he pressed them strongly. So they turned aside to him and entered his house, and he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. That sounds really bland, but who's doing the baking here? It sounds an awful lot like Lot is doing it himself. But he's got a wife, he has 2 daughters. What's going on here? I have a feeling that they're somewhere else in the house doing their own thing. I was talking to my dad about this last night, and we were wondering, did he actually marry someone from Sodom? Daughter of one of the men there. Because it looks like he was about to marry his daughters to 2 men of Sodom. He had integrated and probably regretted it. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, which may be a bit of an exaggeration, because where were the sons-in-law in this? We'll come to them later. But it was an overwhelming crowd who came and said, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us. This was not a social gathering. When Scripture says that we may know them, that's usually a euphemism for something. Because when Lot goes out to confront them and shuts the door behind himself, so you can almost see him just sort of leaning his back against the door to make sure that nobody gets past him. Here's what he says to his neighbors. I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. And the man's desperation really shows. Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof. He is appealing to this powerful culture of hospitality to say, they're my guests now, I must protect them. To the point of even sacrificing his own family to maintain his honor. Honor does not seem to be something that his neighbors are concerned with. They tell him, stand back, and they start complaining, well, this fellow came to sojourn, and he has become our judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. And they surged forward and drew near to break the door down, but the 2 angels kind of wonder how, if the door was shut, they managed to sneak it open, grab Lot, and yank him back inside. But they did, and they shut the door. And just as a bonus, they struck with blindness the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great, so that they wore themselves out groping for the door. If this were not so nasty, it would be funny. But here's what they say to Lot. Have you anyone else here? It's a kind of a telling question. Sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city, bring them out of the place. We are about to destroy this place because, and some people who will say, well, you know, the God of the Old Testament is all judgment and anger and wrath, but listen to what they say. It's not, this city has so provoked God that he can no longer tolerate them. What do they say? The outcry against the people of the city has become great before the Lord. Who would be the source of the outcry? Victims of these predators. It is because there have been so many victims that the outcry has become so great that the Lord has decided it is now time to deal with them. It isn't a matter of him just losing his temper with them, finally. It is a matter of justice. The outcry against Sodom has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. And the really sad part is, from 14 onward, we realize how little influence Lot has had in this place, righteous though he may have been. First, he goes to his prospective sons-in-law. Up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city. And they thought he was joking. Do you not know what's been happening around here? No, to them, this is a joke. It reminds me of, go back to 2 Peter, about the people who were like, well, everything goes on the same way it has since the beginning. Where's this coming of the Lord? They're taking it the same way. They're like, yeah, your God is going to rain down judgment on us. Ha ha ha, that's very funny. And morning is coming, the time is up. And the angels tell him, you take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city. But Lot lingered. I don't know why, we're not told. But somehow, he can't tear himself away from. You think about the things that he had. He owned a house. He had possessions. It could be he was still trying to persuade people to leave. We don't know, but the time was up. So the 2 angels, they take hold of him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him. And they brought him out and set him outside the city. And as they brought them out, one said, escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away. And Lot, Abram argued for mercy for others, right? If you have 50 people, well, what if 5 are missing? 45? 40? 30? 10? Lot's argument is, I know what you just said, but I can't do it. Oh no, my lords. Behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life, but I cannot escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, this city is near enough to flee to, and it's a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved. So Lot, in his perceived weakness, argues for the sparing of one of the cities of that valley, Zoar. And the angel says, behold, I grant you this favor also. You think about the Lord having mercy on him. I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Escape there quickly, for I can do nothing until you arrive. The justice of God did not sweep Lot away with the rest. But the sun had risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar. And the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife, behind him, looked back. Which is kind of what suggests to me that she was native to that area. And contrary to the command, she turns back. She stops running and becomes a pillar of salt. I don't know how that happens. Don't know how it worked. But they were warned. Don't stop, don't look back until you are safely out of the way. So now he's down to 2 daughters. And it says, Abram went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord. And he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward the land of the valley. And he looked, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of the furnace. And so it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. So 2 things strike me here. Abraham was not far away when this happened. He was within view of the catastrophe. And I can't help but think, if he had run to save Lot from the capture during that period of warfare, that he would have sent to find out where he was and how he was and if he could do anything for him. And yet, here's what we find about Lot. Lot's story ends very badly, very unsatisfactorily. That he went up out of Zoar, which they had promised not to overthrow, but he was so afraid that he goes and moves into caves in the hills with his daughters. He was too afraid to live in Zoar. Well, for one thing, it's a little late to be going to the hills. You were told that, and you said, no, I can't do that. I'll go to Zoar. And they said, okay, fine, go to Zoar. And in the caves in the hills, his two daughters, which is, again, why I would strongly assert that Lot was the only righteous person in that area, his two daughters decide, well, so much for marriage. There isn't a man on earth to come into us after matter all the earth. So they decide to make their father drunk and sleep with him and have children by him. So here Lot ends in cowering in fear in caves, drunk, committing oblivious incest. What happened to the man? He had spent so much time with Abram. He had seen his faith, his worship. I can't help thinking that a lot had started for him when he took the look east and west, saw the pretty landscape, and thought, that looks like a nice place to live. His judgment was kind of bad. But he tried. He stayed, but he tried to do what was right in the midst of them, to the point where Peter describes him. Go back to that. As a righteous man who lived among them day by day, tormenting his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard. But he'd had a choice. He still had a choice. Even after the place was overthrown, he had a choice. His kinspeople, even if he had lost everything in that great conflagration, he could have gone to Abraham. He decided to hide out in the hills, too afraid. And all we know then, later on, is that the children born from that unfortunate ending were the Moabites and the Ammonites. Do those names sound familiar to you? Well, they should, if you're familiar with the Exodus. In a couple weeks, we're going to be talking about Balaam, which as a child was one of my favorite stories in the Bible. The guy who gets told off by his own donkey. But you know what? He is prophesying the behest of the Moabites, Lot's descendants, who are trying to circumvent the blessing that the Lord has put on Abram's descendants so that they could destroy them. So much happens from choosing to go and hide out in the hills. It's kind of sad. There is one more mention of Lot in the New Testament I haven't mentioned yet, and that's from Jesus. Luke 17. In addition to likening the day of the Lord to Noah, how everything had gone exactly as it had been up until the gates of the ark shut. But likewise, just as it was in the days of Lot, They were eating and drinking, buying and selling, planting and building. But on the day when Lot went out from Sodom, fire and sulfur rained from heaven and destroyed them all. And so it will be on the day when the Son of Man is revealed. And there's a reminder. One of the shortest verses in the Bible, 3 words. Remember Lot's wife. We don't even know her name. But what do we know of her? She could not separate herself from that which the Lord had condemned. She looked back in longing, and she was destroyed. It is really sad that Lot's story, though he was known as a righteous man, is best used as a warning than as an encouragement to emulation. But that is what Lot was. Though he had seen firsthand Abram's faith, he made some bad choices. And he let himself get tangled up in those bad choices and continued on down a path that he didn't have to go on. Speaking of, next week we will be looking at Sarah and Hagar. Speaking of bad choices that you didn't have to make. So I highly recommend your attention to Genesis, chapters 16, 17, and 18. But also Galatians chapter 4, the end of the chapter. And we will discuss those next week. We could stop recording, then we can come out and play. Anybody